First, I'd like to invite to the stage longtime journalist and journalism supporter Barbara Raab of the Jonathan Logan Family Foundation. Barbara will interview funders who are newer in their support for journalism, what drove their interest, what they're learning, and how aspiring grantees can make their case.
Thank you so much, Jonathan, and hello to everybody. Thanks for joining us for this session. My name is Barbara Raab, and I am the Senior Program Advisor for the Jonathan Logan Family Foundation. We are based in the Bay Area, but I myself live and work in New York City, so that's where I'm joining you from today. Just quick background. Prior to my current role at the Jonathan Logan Family Foundation, I was the journalism funder at the Ford Foundation, and prior to that, I spent 25 years in television newsrooms as a writer, producer, and an editor. Quick sketch of the Jonathan Logan Family Foundation. We have 4 main program areas, all of them through a social justice lens. We fund arts and culture, documentary film, democracy, and journalism, especially investigative journalism. And in connection with this panel, I just want to mention that our journalism grants portfolio does include INN and also includes the annual Newsmatch campaign, which many of you may be familiar with, but if you're not, Newsmatch is INN's annual fundraising effort for nonprofit newsrooms that combines a matching gift program, a community of learning, and the tools to drive local support for high quality local journalism. So as Jonathan said, our conversation here today is with some of the funders who are relatively new to journalism. And what I'd like to do is start off with the same question to each of our panelists, and I will introduce each person as we go around. So the question is, how does your foundation currently support journalism? Who are you funding? And most importantly, what stimulated your interest in moving into this area?
Barbara, let's get your panelists up on stage, and then I will turn this all over to you. I can't wait to hear this conversation. I know it's going to be great. So we'll welcome Natalie Kelinske of the Waco Foundation, Katherine Plog Martinez from KP Catalyst, Daphne Moore of the Walton Family Foundation, and Tracie Powell of the Pivot Fund to the stage. Barbara, over to you.
Thanks again, Jonathan. Welcome, everybody. And I think what we'll do is we'll start with Natalie, who I would describe as a place-based community funder. She's the Director of Communications and Donor Services at the Waco Foundation in Waco, Texas. Natalie, tell us about your work with journalism.
Thank you, Barbara, and thanks everyone for having me today. So as Barbara mentioned, Waco Foundation is the community foundation, and we serve a geographic area that just includes McLennan County, which is about 250,000 people. So a fairly small foundation serving a relatively small geographic area. We are actually not funding local news at this moment in time, but we are looking to get into the space. And most recently, we contracted with the American Journalism Project to conduct a landscape analysis of our community. We are not different than many communities who are experiencing a decline in local journalism. We do still have a daily paper, but their staff has been cut dramatically, and I think they're operating with about 4 reporters. So the level, amount, and quality of journalism that's being conducted is not adequate for our community. So the American Journalism Project is helping us with our assessment, and based on those findings, we hope to launch a solution for Waco, and the Community Foundation plans to be a primary funder and supporter.
Thanks, Natalie. And before we move on with the other panelists, just quickly, could you tell us how this crisis really in local news in your community bubbled up to the point where you have started to do this landscape analysis and hope to move into the space?
Sure. So I think it was a topic on all of our board members' minds for many years. We all saw how local news was declining, but I don't think it was really thought of as a philanthropic campaign or part of our work until the last few years. I actually attended a couple of night media forums, and that really showed me, and then I brought it back to our board, that philanthropy can play, and I would argue should play, a big role in providing solutions.
Hear to that. Next, we're going to hear from a national funder that has been expanding its work to include journalism. Daphne Moore is the head of communications at the Walton Family Foundation. And Daphne, I know your foundation's priorities are K through 12 education, climate change, and then work in your home region, Northwest Arkansas and the Arkansas-Mississippi Delta. So given that, tell us how journalism and particularly your support for Newsmatch came about.
Great. Thank you, Barbara, and excited to be here and join you all. And as you said, we have 3 primary program areas at the foundation. We are about a 35-year-old family-led foundation, the personal philanthropy of founded by Sam and Helen Walton, now led today by their children, grandchildren, and spouses. And we found ourselves unsuspectingly as one of the larger funders of journalism in the philanthropic space. And it came about because we were really thinking about the work in our 3 program areas, and through a belief that a public that is informed not only about the challenges and the problems that we're trying to address in our programs, but also potential solutions is going to be more willing to support those solutions. And so that's really how we approached it, was through the 3 program areas, and did some back of the napkin math one day and found out that we were probably one of the top 10 funders of journalism. And so we've really been thinking more, putting some structure around how we approach that. And so we fund news organizations, both traditional as well as new organizations. We have worked with associations on journalist training, and then we've also stood up a couple of news desks that provide direct funding to individual journalists. And so as we've seen all this growth through our programs, we have come back and said at the foundation level, okay, what else can we do? And so we're running a smaller fund, really looking at innovation and helping us understand new and innovative ways to reach diverse audiences of color, really wanting to understand what works and also what doesn't.
Daphne, quick follow-up. Could you just elaborate a little bit on one of the things you just ticked off, which is you said you've stood up, I don't know if you said news desks or news beats, but could you just explain what you mean by that and what they are?
Yeah, I mean, the one that comes to mind is at the University of Colorado Boulder, and it's a water desk. And what that project does is basically provide direct funding to journalists who want to cover issues of water in the West.
Got it. Thank you. And just a reminder that we will have Q&A portion of this conversation. So if you do have questions for the panelists, please put them in the Q&A tab, and we'll get to those in just a little bit. Now let's move on to Tracie Powell, who is the founder and principal of the relatively new Pivot Fund. And the Pivot Fund's mission is to increase financial and capacity building support for newsrooms that serve and are led by Black, Indigenous, and other people of color. Tracie, your support for journalism and your work in journalism has been a common theme for several years, but with the Pivot Fund, you're doing something somewhat different. So tell us a little bit more about that.
Yes, happy to. And thank you, Barbara. And thank you to INN for having me participate on such a great panel. So the Pivot Fund is shifting power by giving BIPOC newsrooms access to resources, power, and our networks. I alongside Rodney Mahone, identify and fund independent, for-profit, mostly for-profit, and nonprofit newsrooms that not only provide critical news and information to underserved and undervalued communities, but they also have the potential to lift up the general information system overall in their communities. I think, you said Black and Indigenous. We really look at news outlets that kind of cross an intersection of race, ethnicity, language, gender identity, sexual orientation, the gamut. And so the one thing that we really do differently than perhaps other funders is we start by looking at communities and how they access news and information, where they get it from, and what they do with it once they have it. And then we start looking at ways to fund. And so that's what the Pivot Fund does differently from others.
Tracie, quick follow-up for you. You just mentioned that a lot of the newsrooms that you support are for-profit newsrooms, which may come as a surprise, I think, to many in the audience, since INN focuses on nonprofit news. But maybe just a quick explanation of how it is or why it is that in your world, for-profit newsrooms are a necessary piece of the puzzle.
Absolutely. Because most of the organizations, when we talk about BIPOC-led and serving news organizations, are for-profit, but they provide a public good. The fund itself, the Pivot Fund, takes on the burden of making sure that we're meeting that definition that the IRS sets for us in terms of being an organization that provides a public good. And so that's a key distinction. Most of those BIPOC organizations are not nonprofit. And more importantly, they're not part of existing networks such as INN or even, some of the other affinity organizations. They are not part of those networks. So that's a key distinction for what we do.
Okay, thanks. Finally, I want to bring on Katherine Plog Martinez, who is the founder of a firm called KP Catalysts, which is a boutique consulting firm focused on education. And Katherine, it's really interesting to have you join us today because your firm is not a foundation at all, and yet you've recently moved into support for journalism, again, as we heard earlier, in the context of the Newsmatch campaign. So please tell us what you're up to.
Yeah, thanks so much, Barbara. I agree. As the non-funder and foundation on the panel, it really is exciting to be here. So Knowledge to Power Catalysts, a large portion of our work is really looking at building connections and the infrastructure that we need to connect the K-12 system with out-of-school time systems and other youth development organizations. And we believe that a big part of that infrastructure, as Daphne just said, is knowledge and awareness and the things that come through a newsroom. So as we were building a partnership with the Center for Sustainable Journalism and their publication Youth Today, we began talking about guest opinion essays and building out an advisory council. And we very quickly realized that we needed and wanted to put our money where our mouth was and also become donors and contributors to the center. Newsmatch really provided the impetus and great opportunity to do that, as our donation was able to be more fully leveraged by the center. So we not only gave, but encouraged others to give. And through Newsmatch, we're able to not double, but grow that investment.
That's terrific. And I'm sure that many of the people in the audience today have either experienced directly or have been hearing about in the other panels and in the discussion about the index, the really kind of explosive growth of local giving. And I think what you're doing is a perfect example, particularly because it is outside of the kind of traditional philanthropic field. So what I'd like to do is go sort of back around the horn, but I do have slightly different questions for each person this time around. Natalie, for the local newsrooms in the audience, how do you recommend that they approach their own community foundations and other place-based funders that may not be supporting journalism or maybe thinking about it but are not quite sure? What makes a compelling case for a place-based foundation?
Well, I think you're probably right. Community foundations, at least in my experience, are a little bit late to this game. And we're just kind of coming around to learning about how we can invest in nonprofit news and journalism. But as far as the case goes, I think that it's really similar. It's all about improving quality of life. That's Waco Foundation's mission, and most community foundations have something similar. And when you look at what local journalism and information does for quality of life, you can really build your case around that. So I really liken it to the symphony. Waco Foundation has funded the symphony for decades, or the art museum, or the theater, or the zoo. So it's not necessarily those social services that can sometimes be a really easy ask, but it's about building the case for improving quality of life. And alternatively, what does quality of life look like if local journalism is non-existent? So for Waco Foundation and our board, that's really what has compelled us to invest first in the study that I mentioned with the American Journalism Project, but then into local journalism and information sharing as a priority initiative of the foundation.
Thanks. One of the things that I have often said in similar conversations is for community foundations, or any funder really, where their focus is on healthy communities, that I think it can be very compelling, right, to say that part of a healthy community is access to high quality information. So it's just another way, another lens through which I think to approach place-based donors. So thank you for that. Daphne, again, you are from a large, high-profile national funder with program priorities that are not explicitly journalism. But as you do this work, how do you work with your program officers and program teams to explore these opportunities, and also to manage the expectations around what it means to be supporting journalism? What does journalism do, and what does it not do?
Yeah, absolutely. So our communications team, we have six positions that are dedicated to our program, so 2 per program, and they work, they really function as part of those program teams, also as part of the comms team, and so they're part of the strategy conversations, and really, thought partners with program staff on how to achieve their broader grant making goals, which transcend a single grant. So for example, we're talking a lot about affordable housing here in our home region. And, what's important is really the public dialogue related to that conversation. And so how can we support news organizations that will cover that and bring clarity and understanding to the public regarding both the challenges and potential solutions. And so our communications team partners really directly with our program teams so that we're thinking about how we can help open up the conversation about these topics. And you're right, like not everyone fully understands that this is not a transactional arrangement when we support journalism, but we really believe that having those issues covered is the first step. And a great example that I'll use is in New Orleans at the Advocate, formerly the Times Pick. As a former journalist, I have trouble not calling it that. We fund a water desk, and that reporter is dedicated to covering issues coastal restoration desk that is dedicated to covering issues of coastal restoration. And having started my career during massive news organization consolidation, I was an education reporter, but I was frequently pulled to something else, or I was pulled, to cover breaking news. And so being able to just preserve that capacity for the news coverage is really important to our work.
Well, I think that's great. And I just want to, emphasize what you said about the fact that funding shouldn't be transactional. You're not purchasing coverage, you are funding journalism. And those are 2 very different things. And I think sometimes when there are new funders in the space, sometimes that is immediately understood. And especially if somebody in your role comes out of a newsroom, you inherently understand that. But I think sometimes there can be some tension around that, which both sides need to engage in that discussion. Tracie, circling back to you. So the Pivot Fund is relatively new, and I'm wondering what are the priorities for your portfolio over the next, let's say, 1 to 3 years?
Yes. So yeah, we launched in January. So we still are kind of new, I guess. Our priorities are really fulfilling our mission, and that is to make sure that communities, particularly communities of color, have access to quality, credible information so that they can go in back to what we said earlier, live better, higher quality lives. That is our passion and it's our reason for existence. That said, we really want to reimagine journalism done differently, journalism done more inclusively and more comprehensively. And we also want to reimagine philanthropy being more inclusive and representative of these communities that we serve, particularly BIPOC communities. So I think, our priorities include providing capital to build capacity and then layer that with resources and technical support to develop content and revenue strategies that lead to sustainability. At the Pivot Fund, we understand that providing training and programming without capacity is a recipe for failure. And finally, I think our priorities include, or I know that our priorities include providing multi-year funding and support for newsrooms and news collaboratives.
So important. Thank you, Tracie. And Katherine, you spoke about your support for Youth Today, which is through the Center for Sustainable Journalism, and doing it through Newsmatch. And with Newsmatch gearing up again in just a few months, what do you think INN's member newsrooms should be thinking about when it comes to making the case to people like yourself who work outside of traditional or typical or maybe even the journalism circles that they expect to be going to? What was compelling for you?
I think there's some things that both Daphne and Natalie said that I want to hearken back to. I think just as we think about journalism being such a critical part of community building, it's also a critical part of field building. So as you're thinking about your publication and thinking about the funders or donors to approach, don't just think about that geographic area, but think about people who are invested in the topics that you're covering, especially if it is a more specialized publication like Youth Today or their other publication focused on juvenile justice. The other thing, and when I think about what was most compelling to us, actually goes back to the piece Daphne was saying about journalistic integrity. What we saw was a publication that had high journalistic integrity, that had some of the best coverage that it had ever had, but had funding that was primarily connecting it to certain places or certain beats. And we wanted to make sure that to really invest in that field building, we got back to a place of broader coverage. And so our participation in Newsmatch was not only because of that match that we already discussed, but also as we were launching a broader capacity building campaign to say, this is what we really need to not just have dedicated beats, but to have a dedicated editor and to start building that broader base of coverage. So field building and continue to emphasize that journalistic integrity. Don't see that as a concern, see that as a real strength in getting folks to come on board.
So can I just ask then, is your support for the newsroom essentially general support? It's not for a specific beat?
That's right. That's right. So our donation was part of general operating, and then our broader capacity building campaign is also for that general operating, to have a dedicated reporter, but not dedicated to a beat. In this case, because Youth Today is a small publication within the Center for Sustainable Journalism, to have someone who can be that reporter who can cover things more broadly as they come up.
Great, thank you. I'm going to go just a few minutes early to the Q&A because we do have some questions. I have more of my own, but I think the audience's questions are better.
I'm sorry, Barbara. Can I just interrupt 1 second?
Of course.
Can we go back to the journalism integrity point?
Sure.
Because oftentimes people look at organizations led by and for communities of color as not journalism. They look at it as advocacy. And for a long time, these organizations have advocated for their communities, but not for issues or candidates or politics. And so now we are seeing publishers more openly say that they're advocates for their community, and they're not looked at as producing, biased news coverage or coverage that lacks integrity. And so that's one of the myths that I want to knock down right off the bat about investing in communities of color and organizations that serve communities of color. These organizations, we can have a conversation about objectivity, but these organizations they are journalism organizations, the ones that the Pivot Fund invests in. They're not advocacy, they're not organizers, they are journalists. And so I wanted to make sure we got that point out there.
Well, Tracie, that's a really good segue to a question that has come in from Angela for you. And she asks, how should philanthropy prioritize / invest in media that more fully reflects and is linked to communities of color? How should philanthropy approach that mission?
So, one of the things is, I think someone said earlier on an earlier panel, funders don't know who these organizations are or where they are, even when they're in their own backyards, they don't know them. And so expanding our networks, working with intermediaries like the Pivot Fund that understands and knows how to identify news organizations serving these communities of color. But I think, the most important thing is understanding that we're not really interested, nor do we need to reinvent or recreate the journalism that we already have or had that has failed us. So we have to include communities and people that we have not included in our networks and in our giving before. We want to start with the community, talk with the community, figure out how they access information, where they're getting it from, and what they're doing with it, just as the Pivot Fund does. And once you do that, that leads you to the information sources that are trusted and that have relationships with the communities that you seek to support.
Tracie, does the Pivot Fund offer, or might you offer, if you don't do it now, what I guess I would call sort of advising to foundations and other donors and philanthropists who may not know where to start?
Yes. So we actually did a landscape analysis in Georgia, and we identified quite a few news organizations that were on nobody's radar, but provide critical news and information for their communities. Currently advising the American Journalism Project on a landscape analysis that they are conducting. So yes, that's definitely part of the work that we do.
We have a question for Daphne. Daphne, Chelsea asks, could you talk a little bit more about Walton's Innovation Fund that you mentioned earlier? What is it? Mm-hmm. What is it?
What is it? Yeah, so what we really are we want to learn and we want to understand, what are some of the new, more innovative ways that organizations are specifically reaching communities of color. And so for an example, there's a group that we just recently funded called Enlace in North Carolina that is using WhatsApp to deliver news to a Spanish-speaking immigrant population in the state. And so, what can we learn from that, and how can we apply that innovation in other contexts? For example, a lot of our work on the Colorado River, there needs to the Native American population is a huge audience there. Are there ways that we can see that type of innovation replicated in ways that is specifically reaching our program audiences as well?
And just a shout out to the Pivot Fund, actually to Tracie before the Pivot Fund, but Tracie was perhaps the first person to be aware of Enlace and to fund Enlace. So thanks for that. And also I should point out that Enlace is also an INN member. And so through Newsmatch, Enlace also receives some support. There was actually another question, Daphne, for you, which is from Becky. And this is to follow up on what you mentioned about supporting specific beats. And Becky's question is, what does a strong request for a specific beat look like? And maybe you could talk about the Water Desk or the Coastline project you mentioned, but what was compelling about that? How can a newsroom make a compelling case for beat support?
Mm-hmm. Sure. I think, it comes down to one, identifying the need and as it relates to our specific program work. There's so many good causes out there. I mean, we all know that. But most philanthropies you're going to find are very focused on specific program-related goals, dedicating their resources to that. So we really want to understand, what is the gap that this potential proposal could fill. And by doing so, for our program areas, how does it expand coverage and understanding of the particular issues that we're working on?
There's a question from Andrew, and I'm not sure if the question is for any one panelist, so anybody can jump in, and it might even be related to what I had said earlier. But Andrew says he's looking for some practical advice. How would you make a so-called community health pitch in the sense of the role that journalism plays in building a healthy public discourse? And I would just say, Andrew, I think the answer is somewhat embedded in your question, because in fact, one of the ways to perhaps make that pitch, and I'd like to hear from anybody else who wants to speak to this, is exactly that, which is, we all are aware of how much misinformation and disinformation is sort of floating around out there. And it can really infect communities and be kind of a disease in communities. I don't mean to carry this analogy too far, but I really do believe that healthy public discourse and high quality information is part of civic health, the health of communities. So that would be my pitch, but I'd love to hear from the rest of you about other ways that might resonate for you or your board or your staff. Anybody want to start? Natalie, you have thoughts about that? Sorry to put you on the spot.
No, yes, I do have some thoughts about that. Of course, that's something that we've spent a lot of time on and thinking through. And there are some very concrete numbers. I will say our board is interested in data and statistics. And so we did a lot of, when I first started pitching this to our board, a lot of research. And there are some very hard numbers that show when local news declines in a community, people lose representation with their elected officials. People lose representation at the local government level, and the communities become more polarized because they're focusing or they're utilizing national outlets to form their conversations. And so we were able to pull a lot of that just data together from trusted resources like the Pew Institute and many others, and put that in front of our board and say, look, this isn't just something we feel inside, but this is something that there's actually concrete numbers to support and back up. And then you can walk out the doors of the foundation and see it with your own eyes in our community. And
that's probably great advice for Andrew and anybody else looking to make the case, is to come in not only with, anecdotal stuff, but actually research that is out there, as you say, by some of the organizations whose mission is to document all this. Do others on the panel have thoughts about this question, how to come in and do that, to make a case that journalism is part of the health of a community? I have another question.
Go ahead, Tracie. To a potential funder, I assume, is the question, or?
Yes, I think that is the question. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think know who you're talking to and understand what their funding priorities are in particular. And there's a lot of resources out there to, identify who's supporting what type of organizations and where this could fit with their particular mission and goals.
Here's a question from Steve that's very interesting. Can the panel comment on what items are needed to make the case for funding an innovation that doesn't yet exist? It feels like one of those New York Times word games, But that's a great question, particularly, I guess, if innovation in news is something that you're interested in funding. It sounds like, Daphne, you were looking at Enlace that was already doing a particular thing, and you created a relationship around that. But what about newsrooms that have compelling ideas for innovations that don't exist yet. And what they're looking for is a partner to help bring that thing into the world.
Laying out what the gap is that this innovation will address, I think, is really important. And then laying out what you're going to track and learn from it, because, you know, chances are things aren't going to go exactly the way that you think they will. And so being able to present a strong learning perspective that, you know, shows how perhaps if the innovation doesn't work in one context, you can pivot and try it in another.
I'm sorry.
So I'll tell you how we did it. So there is a news organization called Documented out of New York, and he approached us about investing in developing a WhatsApp product. And what made it really compelling and interesting to me is that founder had a deep, insightful understanding about how his community and how his audience consumes information. So he was serving immigrants, and he understood that immigrants don't necessarily read in English, and they may not read in Spanish. He was looking at Spanish-speaking immigrants. They may not read or write in Spanish. The way that they consume information was through the ear. And so and in short text messages. And so he wanted to produce a product that would make information accessible to that community. And that made it really, really compelling to me. Now, Documented's WhatsApp product served as the model for Enlace's WhatsApp product. There was peer learning that took place in the cohort that we had invested in, and Documented helped Enlace develop its WhatsApp product. But he started with understanding instinctively how his audience accessed information, and that's what led us to support that innovation.
I'm sorry, go ahead.
I was just going to say, I just want to make a plug here for small business and business donors more generally in this innovation space as well. I think as we think about our decision to begin funding, some of it was that we were also in this space of innovation and trying to figure out how we wanted to support the work we wanted to do. And doing that in partnership versus alone made a ton of sense. So while those foundation dollars are often going to be bigger bang for your buck, don't forget about those corporate and small business donors.
That's great advice. Thank you. We only have a few minutes left, so I'm going to just take one last question, and it's from Josh. And if everyone can take about 30 seconds to answer this $1 million question, here it is. Josh says, it is his understanding that funders get bombarded with requests. Do you have any tips on navigating initial conversations towards making an ask?
Barbara,
Natalie?
I'm happy to start.
Yes.
So I will say it might surprise you. Waco Foundation, at least, has not received any kind of ask or request related to journalism. And even our grant-making requests that we get in, we're not overwhelmed. So we don't receive as many asks as you might expect. And of course, getting to know the program officers at the foundation is very important. I would say the other thing is to take a look at whatever the mission of the funder is. And again, ours goes back to improving quality of life, but our foundation has also made race equity a priority. And we've outlined some other ways that we're working on that, and news just happens to be a part of it. So if you can become familiar with the organization and really know what they're looking to fund and where their interests lie, I would say 9 times out of 10, journalism is always going to have a role in that.
Katherine, do you want to speak to that? How do people, I don't know whether you get a lot of requests or this was really initiated by you, but I suspect after this panel, you will get requests. So what would be a way for people to stand out?
Yeah, so we don't get a lot of requests, I think, but we as an organization are very committed to giving as both individual partners and as an organization as a whole. So I think as you're thinking about business and small business, remembering that often the leaders of the organization are giving from their heart as much as they're giving aligned to their corporate priorities. And so think about how you really know and understand those personal passions.
And Tracie, when somebody is approaching you initially, what that may not even be initially an ask, but it's an initial conversation. Right. Are there things in particular that for you are compelling?
Just stand out top of mind. I think someone who comes armed with questions about what we do and how we fund, to demonstrate that they have an understanding about our priorities or our interests, at least. Someone who's interested in establishing a relationship, not just someone wanting to make an ask for money, is very, very important, because again, we invest for multiple years, 3 years. So this will be it's a partnership, and you have to invest in any relationship or partnership. You have to invest time and effort. And so it's really important that you build that relationship before you ever make an ask.
Thank you, Tracie. And Daphne, thoughts on this question?
Oh. Echo what everyone has already said, and then just add to it, be willing to come in and learn alongside foundation staff and be ready to iterate. Most foundations have, strategies that are set on a, regular basis. We work in 5-year increments, and, coming in with a proposal that doesn't align with that strategy and what it's trying to achieve, can not produce the results someone may want. So being willing to again, really understand what that foundation is working to achieve, and then, collaborate and work together on what that proposal could turn out to be.
And I'll just throw in my own 2 cents as a funder, which is, yes, it's very important to understand who you're talking to. And at the same time, I know when I have an initial conversation, I want to hear what you, the newsroom, want to do. I don't try to figure out what I'm looking for. What do you want to do? What's exciting to you? And if it fits, great. So anyway, we could talk about all of this for a whole nother hour, but we are out of time. I want to thank all the panelists. I hope that this has inspired those of you in the audience who come from nonprofit or any newsroom to go out there and make your pitch. And I hope that for funders that are here and thinking about perhaps getting into this space or further into this space, that this has been informative and motivating. There are lots of compelling cases to be made.